This is going to be a quick review of Chapter 5 that talks about the different tissues in the body. First off, let's figure out what is histology. Histology is the science that studies tissues. And there are four major tissues in the body. We've got epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. So all of our cells in the body are going to have to fit somehow in one of these four categories. Epithelial tissue. The function of epithelial tissue is protection, secretion, absorption, and excretion. It is found on the outer surface of the body, so skin, for example, nails, hair, all of these are considered different kinds of epithelial tissues. It also makes glands are made out of epithelium as well. So are the inner linings of organs, like the mucosal linings of the oral cavity, the mucosa of the intestine. All of those are examples of epithelium. Epithelium does not have blood vessels, okay, and the cells do divide very fast though, and they are usually tightly packed. For connective tissue, that would be the tissue that binds everything together. It is there for support, it could store fat, it can produce blood cells. It is widely distributed throughout the whole body. And this connective tissue, most of connective tissue has a very good blood supply, and it's made out of a protein matrix and cells. Muscle, the function of muscle is movement, and muscle could either be attached to the skeleton, and that would be considered skeletal muscles, or it could be part of the wall of viscera, and that would be smooth muscles, or it could be in the heart, and that is cardiac muscle. The distinguishing characteristic of muscle fibers is that they have the ability to contract. Nervous tissue, the function of nervous tissue is to conduct impulses and relay information, whether that information is sensory or motor or integrative. It is found in the brain and spinal cord and in the nerves. And these are the characteristic or what makes nervous tissue very unique, that it has the ability to communicate with other parts of the body. We'll talk here about intercellular junctions, and that means like how do neighboring cells attach to each other. So there are different ways. Up here we'll see an example of what is known as a tight junction. And in tight junctions, it's kind of like you've sewn the cells together. Okay? And these, you want these tight junctions in areas where you want to prevent leakage. For example, the blood-brain barrier, which is a barrier between the blood and between blood vessels, between the blood and blood vessels, and between the brain tissue. You also want these tight junctions in the urinary bladder, for example, and in the intestines. Desmosomes is the next on the list, and you'll find these in skin. So you want these desmosomes to be in areas where you want some kind of flexibility. So you'll find them on the outer surface, on the outer skin cells. They act kind of like Velcro, where you have extensions from each cell membrane, and those extensions overlap. And then last, down here, you have these gap junctions where there are tunnels between the two cell membranes, so that ions or different molecules can go from one cell to the next. These gap junctions are found in the cardiac muscle fibers. So here is the types of intercellular junctions in a table. Well, first off, we'll talk about the epithelial cells. The general characteristics of epithelial cells is that they, like I said, they cover the body on the outside, and then they are continuous with the inner parts of the body. So that skin will be continuous with the mucous membrane of the oral cavity, for example, or the mucous membrane of the nasal cavity. And then it'll go throughout the whole digestive system, rectal and the anal cavity, for example. It lines all of these cavities, all these hollow organs from the inside. Epithelial tissue will make up glands, and epithelial cells have a free border, and on the other border they will be found on a basement membrane, and it is that basement membrane that separates epithelial tissue from connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is what is known as avascular. It means that it does not have blood vessels, but it will get its oxygen supply from the underlying connective tissue that will diffuse from the connective tissue up to the epithelial cells. These cells usually very rapidly divide, okay, in that if somebody gets an injury to these epithelial tissues, they heal very fast because of their fast divisions. They are tightly packed, and we can divide epithelial tissue according to their shape and according to how many layers. So if the cells are flat, those will be squamous epithelium. If the cells are cube-shaped, they'll be known as cuboidal. If the cells are tall, those are known as columnar cells. According to the number of layers, if it's just one layer of cells, that would be simple. If it's more than one layer, so two or more, would be stratified. Pseudostratified means that it's a falsely stratified, means that it appears layer as if it's layered, but it actually is not. First one to talk about is the simple squamous epithelium, which is this one layer of flat cells, as you can see over here. That is the thinnest kind of epithelial tissue we have, and you'll find those in areas where you want diffusion, fast and easy diffusion of, say, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you'll find them in the alveoli or the air sacs. You'll also find them in the capillaries. The simple cuboidal are just one layer of cuboidal cells, and whenever you think of cuboidal cells, you really want to think about secretion and absorption. So you'll find cuboidal cells in glands, you'll find them in kidneys, so you'll find them also maybe in the thyroid follicles, and you'll also find them covering the ovaries. Now for simple columnar epithelium, simple means that it's just one layer of columnar or tall cells. You'll find simple columnar cells in, for example, in the intestine, in the stomach, or on the inside in the lining of the uterus. Many of these columnar cells would have cilia on top, okay, and cilia that increases the surface area that is in contact with, say, food, if this was an intestinal cell. And a lot of columnar epithelium also have goblet cells. The goblet cells produce mucus. And some have microvilli as well. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium, as we said before, it looks like it is stratified, but it is actually not. So if you look at each cell, you'll see that each one of them reaches the basement membrane. What gives them that pseudostratified appearance is that the cells are so tightly squeezed together that these nuclei are pushed to the side, and it kind of gives you that appearance that there are two different layers of cells. You'll find these pseudostratified columnar in areas like the respiratory passage, where it also has the cilia and has the goblet cells that make mucus, and those will help in the protection of the respiratory passages. Now, stratified squamous epithelium, those are multiple layers of flattened cells. Okay, you'll find them in area of high friction, for example, skin, oral cavity, vaginal and anal canals. The outermost layer is going to be keratinized, meaning that the most superficial layers are dead and have been replaced with a protein known as keratin, hence the name keratinization. Stratified cuboidal, you have several layers of cuboidal cells, and as we said before, that when you think of cuboidal, you kind of want to think of secretions. So you'll find them in the ducts of mammary glands, in the sweat and salivary glands. You also find them in the pancreas. Stratified columnar, these are several layers where the more superficial layer are columnar in shape, and you will find them that lines parts of the male urethra. It also makes sometimes the ducts of the exocrine glands. Transitional epithelium, which is also known as uroepithelium, that means that first off it's many layers of cells, and transitional means that it can change its shape. It has the ability to compress and decompress, as you can see here, these two different cells. So you'll find them, for instance, in the urinary bladder. So when the urinary bladder is full, you compress the cells, as that picture down here. But when you empty the urinary bladder, these cells will go back to their original shape. So, and again, it's known as the uroepithelium because that's where you find them. You find them in the ureters, in the bladder, and in the urethra. Now, glands are made out of epithelium, and we call those glandular epithelium. These are going to secrete substances. These substances could either be hormones or maybe digestive enzymes. We have different kinds of glands. We've got endocrine glands and exocrine glands. An endocrine gland are glands that make hormones. They do not have a duct, and they are going to secrete those hormones straight into the tissue fluid or into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, those secrete into a duct, and those will open into a surface. According to the number of cells of exocrine glands, they are either unicellular, so just made out of one cell, for example, the goblet cell that makes mucus, or is made out of more than one cell, so those are known as multicellular cells. For example, sweat glands, salivary glands, and those could be simple or compound, and we'll understand what that means. So if you look at the structural types of exocrine glands, each exocrine gland has the secretory part of the gland, and that is the part of the gland that's going to make the secretion, and then it has a duct. So again, the secretory part is the darker pink one, and the duct portion is the lighter in color one. So we can divide exocrine glands. If you look at the duct and you see that it is just one duct that does not branch, that is going to be known as a simple gland. But if you look down here, you can see that that duct has branched into several ducts, and that would be a compound gland. We can also divide the glands according to their secretory part. So if the secretory portion looks like a test tube, that would be tubular glands. But if it looks like an air sac, like these over here, this would be alveolar glands. We can also divide glands according to their secretions, according to the kind of secretion. We have murocrine glands, and that means that the cells, nothing happens to the cell during secretion. It is not damaged, and it releases its secretion by exocytosis, and for example, salivary and sweat glands and the pancreas. Apocrine glands are where you lose part of the cell during the secretion. And those, for instance, are mammary glands and ceruminous glands, which are your wax glands in the ear. We also have holocrine glands, and in holocrine glands, you lose the whole gland. You lose the whole cell during, the whole cell is lost, and it becomes part of the secretion, for example, in sebaceous glands. Here you can find in a table the different kinds of epithelial cells. Now moving on to connective tissue. So connective tissue are the tissue that really binds everything together. It is going to fill in all of the gaps or all of the hollow areas that are made by the epithelium. It binds structures together. It provides protection, support. It is a framework. Like I said, it fills in the spaces. Sometimes we can fill in the spaces with fat, so it does store fat. Bone marrow, for example, is another example of connective tissue, so it would produce blood cells. It could protect against infections, and it does help in repairing tissue damage. All connective tissue is made out of an extracellular protein matrix and cells. So depending on what kind of matrix we're using or the cells that are present, that will give us different kinds of connective tissue. Connective tissue is highly vascular, most of it, and we'll get to that exception, and most cells can divide. So we'll take a look first at the major cell types of connective tissue. There are fibroblasts, and fibroblasts look like stars. They're star-shaped cells. They are fixed cells, meaning that they do not migrate from one place to the next. And they are able to secrete fiber into the extracellular matrix. Fibroblasts are responsible for the repairing and healing process. Macrophages, also known as histiocytes, those are phagocytic cells. They will come into an area, and these are wandering cells, so they are not fixed like fibroblasts are. They are part of the immune system. They are kinds of white blood cells, and they do defend against infection. Mast cells are very large cells, and they include, or they carry inside of them, heparin and histamine. The heparin and histamine will be released during an inflammation. So mast cells are responsible for the inflammatory process or an inflammatory response. Heparin is a blood thinner. It'll prevent blood from clotting. And histamine is a vasodilator. Now for the connective tissue fibers, 3 major fibers to talk about. We've got collagen, reticular, and elastic fibers. Collagen fibers are very thick threads of collagen. That is really the body's main structural protein. You'll find them in ligaments, for example, and in tendons. It gives both strength and flexibility. Reticular fibers, those are just thinner versions of collagen. Okay, they're branching out of the collagen fibers, and they are going to form a very delicate supportive network. So you'll find them in the spleen and in the liver, for instance. We also have elastic fibers, and those are made out of a protein known as elastin. They are branching, they can stretch, so they kind of act like rubber bands. So they stretch, and then they can go back to their original shape. So you'll find them in areas where you need that function. For example, in the vocal cords, in the respiratory air passages. You can also find them in the aorta, for example. So here are your components of the connective tissue. So again, you have your cellular component, and you also have your protein extracellular matrix. For a little clinical application on connective tissue, abnormalities of collagen. So we said how collagen is the most important protein matrix found in the body. So if there is a deformity in collagen, that would lead to different diseases. For example, chondrodysplasia, where the collagen chains are asymmetric, and that could cause a stunted growth and deformed joints, as you can see here in this image. These 2 images are for an individual that has Marfan syndrome. There is a deficiency in the protein of fibrillin, and fibrillin is a protein that enters into the composition of collagen. It could lead to these very long fingers, as you can see. It leads to a weak aorta, dislocation of the lens, and a sunken chest. Now we can categorize connective tissue into connective tissue proper and specialized connective tissue. So connective tissue proper are the ones that have, the protein matrix that we talked about and the cells. Specialized connective tissue have something very characteristic to them. So for example, cartilage cells have chondrocytes, which are cells that are unique to cartilage. Bones have osteocytes, which again are cells unique to bones. Blood have white blood cells, RBCs, and platelets, which are cells that are unique to them. We'll talk about connective tissue proper. These are either loose or dense connective tissue, depending on the protein fibers. And loose connective tissue could either be areolar, adipose, or reticular. Dense could be either dense regular or dense irregular or elastic. So the first one on the list is areolar connective tissue. And you can see here that you have these elastic and collagen fibers that are kind of dispersed throughout the structure. And you can also find fibroblasts in there. You can find areolar connective tissue in the subcutaneous layer. You can also find it in between skeletal muscle fibers. Adipose tissues, those are made out of adipocytes, and those store fat. It acts like a cushion and an insulation, so you can find them around, you'll find adipocytes around important organs, like around the kidney and around the heart, and behind the eyeballs. Reticular connective tissue is made mainly out of reticular fibers, and you'll find them to support of some of the bigger organs like liver and spleen, for instance. Now for the dense regular connective tissue, those are made out of collagen fibers that are closely packed together. They're very regularly arranged, hence the name dense regular connective tissue. They have mainly fibroblasts. They are very strong, and they usually bind structures together. For example, tendons, where that will bind a muscle to a bone. Okay, so you got tendons, ligaments. Tendons, ligaments, and the dermis is also, part of it is made out of dense regular connective tissue. The only downside to these is that it has a very poor blood supply. So if somebody gets a tendon or ligament injury, it takes a very long time to heal. Dense irregular connective tissue are made also out of collagenous fibers, but they are very randomly organized, as you can see here. You also find them in the parts of the dermis, and you can find them around skeletal muscles. Elastic tissue are made out of elastic fibers, some collagen fibers and fibroblasts, but elastic connective tissue the name comes from the majority of the fibers being elastic fibers and having that elasticity. You can find them in organs where you want that elasticity, so you can find them in airways, in some of the larger arteries like the aorta. You can find them in parts of the heart, and that's the uniqueness of it, that it provides that elasticity through the elastic fibers, while the collagen fibers gives it a little bit of strength. Now for the specialized connective tissue, first off the list is cartilage, and like I said, specialized connective tissue are named that because they have very unique cells. So the unique cell to cartilage are chondrocytes, and they are they live in these little chambers known as lacunae, surrounded by the matrix. It lacks a blood supply, okay? So, as a general rule, we said the connective tissue is very rich in blood supply. This was the exception to that rule, which is cartilage. Cartilage is covered by a perichondrium, which is a layer of connective tissue. Just like bone is covered by periosteum, cartilage is covered by a perichondrium, and that's where the nutrients are going to be coming from. Cartilage, you have three different kinds of cartilage. There's either hyaline, elastic, or fibrocartilage. Hyaline is the most common kind of cartilage, and as an embryos, as a fetus, when the baby's delivered, a lot of the bone is still hyaline cartilage, and those are going to be how we grow and how we become longer. Those are the growth plates. So we'll talk about hyaline cartilage. That's the most common type. It is made out of fine collagen fibers. It makes the ends of bones, so those growth plates that we just mentioned. It also, the nasal cartilage and the respiratory passages cartilages are all made out of hyaline, and it also makes the embryonic skeleton. Elastic cartilage has lots of elastic fibers in them, and that's why it has some elasticity to it. You can find them in the external ear, so the earlobe, and in the larynx, or the vocal cord, the voice box. Fibrocartilage, those are has very dense collagen fibers. These are shock absorbers, so you can see them in between the vertebral discs. So those are intervertebral discs. You can find them, they also make the knee pads. You can find them also in the pelvic girdle. The second kind of specialized connective tissue that we'll talk about is bone, or osseous tissue. It is the most rigid kind of connective tissue. It is made out of a solid matrix, so the only kind of connective tissue with solid matrix is bone. Okay, it stores the unique kinds of cells are osteocytes. It is a storage area for calcium and phosphate. Bones act as attachment sites for muscles. Okay, as we mentioned before, we have osteocytes, okay, that also rest in these little chambers known as lacunae, and we have two different kinds of bone. There's either compact bone or spongy bone. Compact bone is the one on the outside, also known as cortical bone, while spongy bone is the kind of bone that's in the middle. Compact bone is made out of osteons. Osteons are your structural unit of compact bone, and it is made out of the central canal in the middle. That's where the blood vessel or the blood supply would be. And then surrounding the central canal, you'll have osteocytes that are arranged in these lamellae, or lamella, which are the concentric layers that kind of looks like a tree trunk. You'll find the osteocytes in these layers, and you can see here, this is an image of an osteocyte that is housed within that lacunae, or the chamber that we mentioned. The last of the connective or the specialized connective tissue is blood, and blood is the only liquid connective tissue. It has the plasma is your matrix, and the cells are in there. You have white blood cells that defend against infection. You have red blood cells that carry oxygen, and you also have platelets that assist in blood clotting. This is a table that shows you the different kinds of connective tissue. Then we'll talk about the different kinds of membranes. So membranes are just sheets of cells. Okay, we have 4 different kinds of membranes. 3 of them are epithelial, made out of epithelial tissue. The 4th is made strictly out of connective tissue. So the kinds of epithelial membranes we have, which are serous membranes, is number 1. Serous means a watery secretion. So a serous membrane is going to make a more watery fluid. It will line different body cavities, and it does not open out to the outside world. Those are going to be the cavities, the serous membranes that line, for example, the lungs, which would be pleura, or the serous membranes that lines the heart, so pericardium. The lining is made out of simple squamous epithelium. There is some areolar connective tissue in there, but it is mainly out of the epithelial cells. It'll secrete a serous fluid, which is for lubrication and to decrease friction. Mucous membranes, on the other hand, they also line cavities, but these open out to the outside of the body. For example, the oral cavity, the urinary system, the reproductive tracts. Okay, all of these are lined by epithelium, by mucous membranes, and because they secrete mucus, they are going to have lots of goblet cells. Cutaneous membrane is just a fancier term for skin. It's part of the integumentary system, and it's obviously made out of epithelium. We have a whole chapter dedicated to skin that we'll talk about in more detail when we get to that chapter. The 4th and last kind of membrane is known as a synovial membrane. That is made entirely out of connective tissue, and it lines the joint cavities. So we talked about epithelial tissue, talked about connective tissue. Next is to talk a little bit about muscle tissue. So general characteristics of muscles is that they have the ability to contract. Okay, there are 3 different kinds. We have skeletal muscle fibers, and those are voluntary. Those are attached to bones to your skeleton, hence the name skeletal muscles. Each cell is multinucleated, so these skeletal muscle fibers would have more than one nucleus. And these are stimulated by nerve cells. Smooth muscle fibers are non-striated. These are found in the hulls or in the walls of hollow organs and in the walls of blood vessels. They are involuntary, so we have no control over them. Cardiac muscle fibers are only found in the heart. They are branched cells, involuntary. They are also striated, and they have intercalated discs. In these intercalated discs, this is where you will find the gap junctions that we talked about at the very beginning of this chapter. Nervous tissue is the last kind of tissue to talk about in this chapter, and nervous tissue is obviously found in the brain, spinal cord, or in the nerves. The main cell of the nervous system are neurons, and neurons can either conduct sensory information or motor information or integrative information, which is that connection between sensory and motor. There are also supportive cells in the nervous system that support neurons, and those cells collectively are known as neuroglia or neuroglia, and those support and nourish neurons. Here you can see a table that shows you the different kinds of muscles, muscle fibers, and the nervous tissue. So a little bit of, going from science to technology. So how do we use all of the science that we just learned? For example, we can do what is known as tissue engineering to build a replacement bladder. Okay, it's very hard to find a tissue donor, and sometimes we need these as a kind of an emergency. So what we could do is do what is known as tissue engineering, okay, where we can take the person's own cell, okay, and use that to build a bladder. We would use the progenitor cells, maybe from smooth muscles or from uroepithelium, and somehow program them in order to make a replacement bladder, for example. There are lots of good advantages to this, that there is definitely no rejection by the immune system. So the patient wouldn't go through a rejection process. They wouldn't have to take immunosuppressive drugs before the organ transplant, because it is actually his or her own cells. There's a little video to watch here if you're interested to learn more about this. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 5.